Hi, John Herman here. Going to do another lesson with you. Today I'm going to try something a little bit different. I've been wanting to do a Bible study, but I really couldn't figure out how to do it virtually. So here's my idea. I thought I'd start out with a very short book and see how it goes. It's going to take a little bit of commitment on your parts, and then I'm encouraging you to spend about 30 or 40 minutes reading the book of Esther sometime this week. What I thought I would do today is to give some background information and conclude with a bit of overview of the story so you get the gist of it. Then, next week we can discuss, in quotes, some of the events. Since this is new ground for me, I'd appreciate comments, and please be truthful. I don't really have a feel as to how practical this is. Phone or email is fine. Also remember that I'm going to supply a printed version of this lesson for those of you who may want to read it. So, the story of Esther could easily find its way into a John Grissom novel. It's a riveting story, only 10 chapters long, about a Jewish female hero who uses her wits to thwart the king's second-in-command villain in his plan to annihilate her people. To make it more interesting, the king himself had unknowingly been tricked into issuing the decree. There's no reference to God, worship, or prayer in the entire book. In fact, this is one of 2 books in the Bible in which God is never mentioned. However, God's hand is abundantly at work behind the scenes, as we will see. So, the story takes place in the Persian city of Susa, about 60 years after the first exiles had returned to Jerusalem. You remember, in 586 BC, the Jews of the southern kingdom had been forced into exile by the Babylonians. However, a number of years later, the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland of Jerusalem. But, as it turned out, many of the Jews had taken up roots in their new surroundings, and over the years, they had these roots, and they chose to remain there. Esther, an orphan, and her older caregiver cousin Mordecai were 2 who chose to remain. It's assumed that they were non-practicing Jews, as evidenced by some of their actions, but that's not written in stone, and you can make up your own mind about that one. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week. So, King Xerxes was the king of Persia at the time of the story. It is said that he ruled from India to Ethiopia, which included 127 provinces. So this guy definitely was a powerful man. It's also said that he had a violent temper. One time, when a newly constructed bridge over the Hellespont River was destroyed by a storm, he ordered the river to be flogged 100 times while being cursed by the floggers. And then he ordered the decapitation of all of those who directed the construction. Another time, when a favored military leader asked him to excuse one of his 5 sons from a military campaign, Xerxes got so angry that he ordered the son to be cut in half and his body parts placed on the side of the road as the army marched by. What a guy. So, what I'm going to do is give you a brief synopsis of the book, chapter by chapter. There are 10 chapters. Chapter 1. The story opens with King Xerxes giving a royal banquet for all of his nobles. At the same time, his wife, Queen Vashti, is giving a banquet of her own for the women. On the 7th day of partying, the king gets into high spirits from all the wine and commands that the queen be brought in so that he could display her beauty to the guests. She refused, which really set him off. His advisors told him that if he let her get away with that, all the other women in the region would begin despising their husbands, and there would be no end of disrespect and discord in the land. So, he had her deposed. Chapter 2. Xerxes now needed a queen, so he decreed a beauty pageant to be held. He sent out officials over the whole land to search in his realm for beautiful young virgins. After being chosen, they were to live in his harem for a year, where they would to be given beauty treatments the entire time. When their turn came to be reviewed by the king, she would go to him in the evening and return the next morning. Unless summoned by name, she would not be invited back. As it turns out, Esther was taken by the officials to reside in the harem because she was very beautiful. It appears that she didn't have a choice. She did not disclose her nationality to anyone at Mordecai's request. After her beautification time was completed, she met with Xerxes and immediately won his favor. She was made queen, and a banquet was given in her honor. Meanwhile, her cousin Mordecai happened to overhear a few soldiers conspiring to kill the king. He reported it to Queen Esther, who reported it to the king. She did give her cousin credit for saving the king's life, but did not disclose his relationship to her. The soldiers were, of course, executed. Chapter 3. The king had just elevated a noble by the name of Haman to a very high rank, second only to himself. All were required to bow down to Haman when they met him. Mordecai, however, refused to do that. He was repeatedly commanded to bow, and during this time it was learned that he was Jewish. When Haman found out he refused to bow, he was so angry that he desired to kill not only Mordecai, but all of his Jewish people. He cast a lot, like a die, which was called a pure, and a date was chosen to destroy Mordecai's people, every one of them. Haman then went to the king and told him that a group of people who were causing trouble by not obeying the king's laws, and they should be eliminated. He didn't tell them who this group was. All he said was, there's a group of people that aren't following the laws. The king agreed, and Haman wrote a decree declaring the destruction of all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, and used the king's signet ring to make the order official. Messengers went out and reported their impending doom to all the Jews. Chapter 4. Esther found out about the order from Mordecai through messengers. He pleaded with Esther to speak to the king about the fate of her people. At first she refused, saying that if anyone approached the king without being asked, it would mean sudden death for that person. The only exception was if the king extended his golden scepter at the appearance of this person. However, she had not been summoned for over 30 days, so she really wasn't sure of her present status with the king. She finally agreed, though, realizing that she was going to die either way. Mordecai proposed the idea to her that maybe she was placed in the queen's position for this very purpose. She asked Mordecai to have her people fast for 3 days, and she did the same. Chapter 5. After the 3 days of fasting, Esther gussied herself up and went to see the king. Luckily, the king extended his scepter, and asked about her request for seeing him. She must have been a real knockout because he offered her up to half of his kingdom. She told him that she had prepared a banquet for him and Haman and requested their attendance that very day. He summoned Haman, and Haman thought it was that was going to be honored, of course, because of his pride. And so he and Haman got spirited with wine at this first banquet. Again, he asked, "So what do you want?" She replied that she wanted and Haman to attend another banquet the next day, at which time she would reveal her wish. Haman went home and boasted to his wife about his own health and political stature, and that Esther had required only his presence at a banquet the next day. The only thorn in his side was Mordecai, whom he had seen on the way home, and who still refused to bow to him. His wife said, "Have a gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the banquet and enjoy yourself." Now remember, this form of execution, even though it's called a hanging and a gallows, was actually impalement on a stake, which was a really gruesome way to die. Chapter 6. That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he ordered a record of all that had happened during his reign. He came across the account of Mordecai saving his life by reporting the two plotting soldiers. He asked, "What honor has Mordecai received for saving my life?" The answer was nothing. At that very time, Haman was entering the court to see about requesting Mordecai's execution. Before he could speak, the king said to him, "What should be done to honor a man with whom the king delights in?" Haman, thinking the king was talking about him, told him to dress the person in royal robes and display him on horseback to the nobles and the people in a parade. The king said, "Good, go find Mordecai and do just that." Can you imagine what he thought about that? But he did it. Afterward, Haman went home in grief and told his wife and advisors what had happened. They basically told him that he was doomed because of Mordecai's Jewish ancestry and his plot to kill the Jews. At that very instant, the king's men came to escort Haman to Esther's banquet. Chapter 7. The king again began drinking wine, and after a while, he asked Esther what she wanted. She told him that her people had been destined for total destruction and annihilation, and her request was for the king to intervene. He immediately wanted to know who would dare do such a thing. She replied, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The king flew off in a rage and left Haman sitting there. Haman knew what his face was going to be and stayed behind to beg the queen for his life. Just as the king returned, Haman fell down on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king saw him and thought he was molesting her. At that same moment, one of the eunuchs standing there told the king of the newly erected gallows standing next to Haman's house. The king then ordered Haman to be immediately impaled. Chapter 8. The king gave Esther the estate of Haman. Esther then begged the king to issue an edict that countered the one already issued. At that point in history, it was understood that an edict of the king could not be revoked, even if by the king himself. So there had to be a workaround. So the king asked Mordecai to write another decree, as Mordecai saw fit, that would protect the Jews, and that the king would sign it and seal it. So the workaround Mordecai came up with was another decree that allowed all the Jews to defend themselves on the day of the scheduled massacre. Any and all means were acceptable in defending themselves, and they had the right to plunder any spoils. Chapter 9. The tables were turned. All of the enemies of the Jews, and they had plenty, thought that they could finally get rid of those people, but now they were afraid of them. No one could stand in their way on the selected day. The Jews were able to conquer and destroy all of their enemies, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. And then, to add insult to injury, the king asked Esther if there was anything else she wanted. She requested another day of fighting, and also that all 10 of Haman's sons should be impaled as well. She got her request, and 75,000 more Jewish enemies were killed the next day. The Jews had a celebration, and to this day, the holiday of Purim is observed. Its name comes from the word pur, which refers to the die, as we said, that was cast, that defined that day. Chapter 10. The king elevated Mordecai to a position second in rank only to him. Mordecai was also held in high esteem among all of his people, and you can see why. So, there you have the story of Esther. As I said before, I'm hoping to discuss, in quotes, some of the points that the story raises. For example, God is never mentioned. However, at all of the twists and turns in the plot, you decide for yourself, for all of these events and their timing could have been mere circumstances. Why would we assume that Esther and Mordecai were non-practicing Jews? Was Esther a hero? And so forth. But most importantly, here's what I want you to think about. What life lessons can we learn from this book? I strongly encourage you to read the book by next Sunday so you'll get the most out of the lesson. See you next week.